Hi, welcome back to Joe Blogs. In today's episode, I want to talk to you about what's happening in the Chinese economy, and specifically to talk about the impact that extreme weather is now having on China. 2023 was the hottest year on record since records began in 1850. And every year it seems that we're breaking new boundaries in terms of the highest temperature, the longest heat wave, the biggest floods, the biggest droughts. Things are becoming more and more extreme. And that's really bad news for some renewable energy, and specifically for hydroelectricity, which is actually the most common form of renewable energy that's being installed at the moment. And China is at the forefront of hydroelectricity. It has around 30% of the total global capacity for hydro. But the problem with hydroelectricity is that it relies upon water, and that water predominantly comes in the form of rainfall. So when you have droughts and prolonged periods of low rainfall, that causes major problems. It reduces the amount of electricity that you can produce, and that's now having a major impact on the Chinese aluminium business. And apologies to anybody that didn't understand what I just said, because aluminium is the British pronunciation of the word aluminum. Now, aluminum and aluminium are exactly the same product, but they're spelt differently. The US version is aluminum, it only has one I. Aluminium has two I's, so that's why it's pronounced differently. Now, I like to think that I'm pretty much bilingual. I can say aluminum or aluminium, and I may dip in and out throughout the course of this video. So in today's video, we'll start off by having a look at what's been going on with the weather and what's causing these extreme weather conditions to be occurring all across the globe. We'll then talk about hydroelectricity, how it works, and how it generates all of the power that's needed for some of these Chinese businesses. We'll then talk about aluminum production in China. We'll go on to talk about the problems that China is having with regards to its droughts and floods, and what the impact of that is on the Chinese economy. And then finally today, I'll wrap up with my summary. So what I think the impact of this extreme weather has been on China, what the potential impact is on the global economy, and what's likely to happen over the course of the next 3 to 5 years. But before we get started on all of that, I'd like to say once again, thank you so much to everyone that's supporting the channel. If you've signed up as a long-term supporter, either through Patreon or Buy Me a Coffee membership or YouTube membership, thank you for that long-term support. Really helps to keep me motivated, and it tells me that I'm on the right track, that I'm doing something right with the channel. So thank you. And if you've sent me a YouTube super thanks or bought me a coffee over the course of the last week or so, thank you for the time and effort that you've taken to do that. Really appreciate it. I do see all of those messages, don't get time to respond to all of them, but thank you for that support. Really helps to keep me going. As I mentioned at the start of today's video, 2023 was a record-breaking year in terms of global temperatures. And when we talk about global warming, I prefer to use the term extreme weather conditions, because global warming sounds like it's going to be a good thing. If you're going on your holidays, you want it to be nice and warm, unless obviously you're going to the Antarctic, when you don't really want it to be super hot. But overall, I think the biggest impact on the global economy isn't because everything's getting warmer. It's because of the extreme weather conditions that are now impacting on certain regions over a long period of time. And this is now having catastrophic implications in terms of the economy. And that's what we're going to talk about in today's video. We're going to focus in on what's been happening with the Chinese aluminum business. This chart plots the 5-year average for the global surface temperature dating back to 1850. And the scale on the left-hand side of this chart is shown in degrees centigrade and goes from 0 at the bottom to 1.5 degrees at the top. So what this is showing is basically an index looking at the temperature and comparing it to the average temperature in 1850, which was the pre-industrial period, so before we had heavy industry all around the world. And what this shows is that between 1850 and the early part of the 20th century, there was no noticeable long-term increase in average temperatures. However, from around 1920 onwards, you can see that the average global surface temperature started to increase and moved above the 0-degree line. And since that time, we have seen a rapid increase in average global surface temperatures. And this chart shows the annual average increase in global temperatures dating back to the late 1960s. And what this shows is that there has been an increase in virtually every single year over the last 50 years or so. And we are seeing progressively higher and higher temperatures. And in 2023, the globe achieved a record high and touched 1.5 degrees above that benchmark from 1850. And 2023 went on to become the hottest year on record, overtaking the previous hottest year, which was set in 2016. And one of the problems with an increase in the global temperature is that it results in more extreme weather. And the reason why the world is now experiencing more and more extreme weather is highlighted in this chart, which shows the average temperature as a bell curve. We've got cold on the left and hot on the right. And what this shows is that as temperatures heat up, so we move further to the right of this chart, the probability of more hot weather and extreme hot weather gets higher and higher. And the reason that that's a problem from a rainfall point of view is that more heat generally causes more evaporation, so more water rises up into the atmosphere, therefore more clouds are formed, they become bigger and denser and heavier, and the rain that they deliver becomes torrential, and that's when you can get flooding in areas, but also you can have droughts, because if areas dry out, if they get all of the water sucked out of them, and then those clouds move away from that region and they deliver their rain somewhere else, you can have extreme situations where you have drought in some regions and excessive flooding in others, or potentially you may have both. And when you have that situation, that can cause catastrophic impacts on both the local environment and therefore the local economy. The problems that are currently being experienced by the Chinese aluminium industry are the result of the fact that the hydroelectricity plants in certain areas of China have less water than they were meant to, and therefore are generating lower levels of electricity. And that's now having a major impact on those businesses because they require a high volume of electricity for long periods of time. So before we get into the details of talking about exactly what's going on with the Chinese aluminum production, let's talk about hydroelectricity, because I think it's important to understand how hydroelectricity actually works to get a better understanding as to why the extreme weather that's currently being experienced all across the world is having a negative impact on the production of that electricity. Now, hydroelectricity, the clue is in the title, is generated using hydro, so basically water. And large volumes of water are held behind dams, and that water is then released to generate electricity. And it's a genuine renewable source of energy. And the reason that it's renewable is because of the water cycle. So here you can see we have a dam on the left-hand side of this diagram. As water evaporates under the strength of the sun, it's converted into clouds. Those clouds then build up, and at some point they deposit their moisture in the form of rain. That rain then tops up all of the water that's sitting behind the dam and therefore renews the water supply that's being used to create electricity. So this represents a perfect form of renewable energy as long as you have sufficient rain to keep filling up your water reserves. And the way that water is converted into electricity is shown in this illustration. So the water is released from the dam. It's passed through what's called a penstock to build up its velocity. That water, as it passes through, then turns a turbine, which starts moving rapidly as the water passes through it. That's connected to a generator and a transformer, and that kinetic energy from the water is converted into electricity, which is then fed through power lines to your house to make your toast in the morning. So all of that obviously sounds fantastic, but I wouldn't be making this video today if there weren't problems with hydroelectricity. And the main problem, as I've identified so far in this video, is that if you don't get sufficient rainfall to keep topping up your water supplies, then you don't get the same volume of water passing through those turbines, and therefore the amount of electricity that you generate starts to fall. And when you've got major industries that have been built that are dependent upon that electricity and huge volumes of it, that's when you start having problems. And that's exactly what's happening in China right now. But before we get into the details of what's going on with regards to the droughts and the hydro, let's talk about the process of making aluminium. Aluminum, or aluminium depending on which side of the fence you're on, is the most abundant metal on Earth, and it's also one of the most useful because it's malleable, It's light, it's anti-corrosive, it conducts heat and electricity, and it's used in a variety of different applications all across the world. But in order to produce aluminium, you have to take the raw material, which is generally a rock called bauxite, which contains elements of aluminium as well as other things. And that bauxite has to go through a heavy industrial process before you get the end product. The production of aluminium using the Bayer process starts off with bauxite ore, which is crushed down into 10mm particles in order to make it easier to use. That crushed bauxite is then passed through a grinding process and then what's called digestion, where it's heated to 270 degrees centigrade, which forms a supersaturated sodium aluminate solution. That solution is then passed through a clarification and filtration process before being heated to 1100 degrees centigrade to remove the bonded water molecules and produce aluminium oxide, which is the chemical name for alumina. And this alumina is now ready to be put through the aluminium smelting process. And this is the process that requires large amounts of electricity. Alumina is converted into molten aluminium through what's called the Hall-Héroult process. As electricity passes through the solution, an electrolytic reaction happens, which breaks alumina into hot molten aluminium and oxygen. The oxygen produced consumes carbon from the anode used in the process and forms carbon dioxide. And this is one of the reasons why aluminium production is bad for the environment, because it produces large amounts of CO2. At this stage in the production process, molten aluminium can be used to form all of the end products, and it can also be mixed with other elements to create alloys, such as silicon, magnesium and copper, and these alloys are used for specific industrial purposes. Liquid aluminium and other elements are mixed and heated in a furnace, and the molten aluminium is then cast using different techniques. In sow casting, liquid metal is poured directly into a mould and allowed to solidify, and these products can be remelted for use in electronics and the aerospace industries. The molten aluminium can also be poured into moulds to create ingots, which are used to produce things like car wheels, car engine blocks, and other automotive parts. It can be cast into sheets, which are flat products that are used in packaging, the automotive industry, and lithography. It can also be cast into billets, which are used in the automotive, construction, and aerospace industries. So as you can see from this process, it is highly intensive and uses large amounts of electricity. And the problem that you have if you're a producer of aluminum is that you need a constant supply of electricity, because you don't want to be heating up all of your processes and then having to cool them back down and then heating them up again, because that will cause damage to all of your equipment. You need there to be a constant flow of electricity to keep everything running 24/7. And one of the problems that is now happening in China is that the hydroelectric power stations are not producing sufficient electricity to keep all of those aluminum plants running 24/7. China is a very large country, both geographically and also in terms of its population. It has a population of over 1.4 billion people. And in order to try to reduce its reliance on imported coal and oil, China has been developing its renewable energy. And the main area it's been focusing on is hydroelectricity. This chart shows the countries that produce the most electricity using hydroelectric power stations in 2023. And as you can see, China is right at the top of this list, having produced 1,245 terawatt hours of electricity, which is almost 3 times the amount the next largest country, Brazil, generated at 431 terawatt hours, 3.5 times the amount of electricity produced in Canada using hydro, and over 5 times the amount produced in the USA. And the amount of electricity China generated using water power was actually more than Brazil, Canada, the USA and Russia combined. So China has clearly made a massive commitment to hydroelectricity. But interestingly, I thought it was worth looking at this chart, which shows the total percentage of electricity produced in each country. And what this shows is that Paraguay have gone all in on hydroelectricity. 100% of their electricity production in 2023 came from hydro. Norway are almost there. 88.5% of their electricity comes from water. Venezuela are at 77.6%. Laos at 72.7%. Colombia 62.5%. Brazil 60.5%. Austria 59.4%. and Canada 57.5. And if we look further down the list, you can see that China's hydroelectric production represents 13.2% of total electricity production in China. The biggest source of power from China's point of view is still coal. And this chart shows the total amount of installed hydroelectric capacity dating back to 2000. And what this shows is that China's hydroelectric capacity has increased in every single year over the last 23 years. And in 2023, the total capacity was 422 million gigawatts. So this clearly shows China's ongoing commitment and investment into hydroelectricity. However, the problems that are now being experienced in China are highlighted in this chart, which shows the actual amount of electricity generated in each year dating back to 2000. And what this shows is that between 2000 and 2020, there was generally an increase in every single year. There was a slight dip in 2011, but apart from that year, there was a year-on-year increase in the amount of power being generated. However, that situation has changed over the last 3 years. You can see that in 2021, there was less electricity generated than in 2020. It did increase in 2022. However, the total amount generated was still less than it was in 2020. And in 2023, there was a significant fall in the amount of electricity generated to 1,141 billion kilowatt hours. And that level was actually lower than all of the previous 4 years. And you have to go back to 2018 to have a comparable level of electricity. And if we quickly jump back and have a look at what's been happening to capacity over that period, since 2018, the total installed capacity in China has increased by almost 20%, from 353 million kilowatt hours to 422. So when you look at the amount of power that's being generated, what this tells us is that there are problems with those hydroelectric plants. And the reason that there are problems with those plants is because of what's happening with rainfall. And this chart shows the annual precipitation between 2018 and 2024 for the Sichuan-Yunnan border, which is an area that has a lot of the hydroelectric power stations. And what this shows is that between 2018 and 2020, there was an annual increase in the level of precipitation. However, since 2020, there has been a noticeable reduction and a significant downward trend in terms of the total amount of rainfall. And clearly, when you're talking about hydroelectricity, if you have a reduction in rainfall, that means you've got less water, therefore you've got less raw materials to be dealing with to create the electricity, and therefore you're going to generate less power. China is by far the world's largest producer of aluminum. This pie chart of the globe shows the countries that produce the most aluminum in 2023, and the size of each country is proportionate to the amount of aluminum it produced. And as you can see, China is out on its own in terms of the amount of aluminum it's producing. In 2023, it produced 41 million tonnes, which represented around 59% of all of the aluminum produced globally. The world's second largest producer was India, which produced 4.1 million tonnes, so around 10% of the amount that China produced. The third largest producer was Russia at 3.8, followed by Canada at 3, United Arab Emirates at 2.7, Bahrain at 1.6, Australia at 1.5 million, Norway 1.3 million, Brazil 1.1, and the whole rest of the world added together produced around 9.5 million. So this chart really highlights what a dominant position China has in producing aluminum. As I mentioned earlier in the video, China is now looking to move away from its dependency on importing coal to produce electricity and wants to use hydro for more and more of its industrial applications. And over the last few years, the Chinese authorities have persuaded some major aluminum producers to move their capacity to the Yunnan region, which previously was known for producing tea and wild mushrooms. But because of the huge hydroelectricity plants that China has built in the region, it wanted the aluminum producers to move there so they could benefit from both green electricity and also very cheap electricity. So this was potentially a fantastic opportunity for both sides. all of the electricity that was being generated could be used by the aluminum producers, and those aluminum producers would be able to benefit from both green electricity, so they're calling their metal green metal now, and also the fact that it was very cheap. So this looked like a great idea. However, the problem has been that since that has happened, the rainfall has fallen significantly in the area, as we've just seen from the charts. So that means that those electricity stations are not producing enough power to actually feed all of these aluminum producers. And so these companies are now in severe difficulty because, as I mentioned earlier, you can't just switch all of your machinery on and off depending on how much electricity there is. You need to have a constant feed so that you can keep everything operating at the right temperature and not have everything cooling down. And this is now causing severe problems. Despite growing demand for low carbon products and strong industry profits in recent years, 4 Chinese aluminium smelters in the Yunnan region have had to cut their production by between 10 and 40%. In addition to hindering China's climate goals, the hydro crunch has also caused volatility in global aluminium prices and imperiled the potential for producers to cash in on demand for green metal. The plan to move almost 4 million tonnes of production from the Shandong province to Yunnan involved building 2 plants near the Vietnam border, each with capacity of roughly 2 million tonnes. The first of these factories was built at a cost of around $2.35 billion and opened in 2020. And was intended to reach full capacity by August 2022. However, it's not been able to reach that capacity due to unstable hydroelectric power. Aluminium accounts for around 3% of the world's direct industrial carbon dioxide, and due to the amount of aluminum that China produces, cleaning up the sector is crucial to its goal of achieving net zero by 2060. And as a result of this, aluminum producers were attracted to the region to produce green metal and also to benefit from very cheap electricity. A 2022 World Economic Forum report anticipated that 2 to 3 million tonnes of primary aluminium production would move annually to China's southwest, mostly Yunnan, from 2020 to 2025. However, due to problems with generating electricity, the pace has been significantly slower. In January 2024, Yunnan's Water Resources Department said that severe drought had persisted for a fifth of the year and led to a reduction in hydropower generation. And on April the 16th, officials in the area warned of extreme drought conditions in Yancham County, where several aluminium plants are located. Average rainfall so far this year is down 37%, according to the Wenchang government. So what's the summary and conclusion today? Well, I wanted to post this video because I think what's happening with regards to hydroelectricity, not just in China, but all across the world, and also what's happened with regards to the aluminium producing companies in China that moved specifically to be close to that renewable, cheap energy source, are really fascinating. And this really puts into perspective all of those stories that you're constantly hearing about global warming. There's always something on the news about extreme rainfall and flooding, or droughts, or excessive heat, or something along those lines. And it's quite easy to brush all of those stories off and think, well, it doesn't really matter. Yeah, okay, somebody is suffering because their house is flooded, or they're having a drought and some farmer can't grow enough food, but it doesn't really have that big an impact. But when you look into the details as to what's happening all across the world, it does have a really big impact, because the world is trying to reduce the amount of carbon dioxide that it's generating. It's trying to move away from using fossil fuels like coal to produce electricity. And if you've been following the channel, you'll know that I recently posted a video talking about the fact that coal usage is now at an all-time high, which seems incredible. Everybody is probably thinking, didn't we give up coal years ago? Well, maybe you did if you're in a developed country, but in places like India and China, they're still using a lot of coal to generate electricity. Now, obviously, there are a lot of targets to reduce that fossil fuel usage, and China has been at the forefront of developing its hydroelectric capability. It's actually been putting on more than the next 4 countries combined, and it now has around 30% of the global capacity. But the problem with hydro, as we've identified in today's video, is that it's dependent on rainfall, and nobody is controlling rain. Rain happens where it will. And the issue with regards to global warming is that it's resulting in more and more extreme weather patterns. So we're seeing excessive rain in some areas where we get huge floods and we get a lot of rain in one day. And then we'll have droughts in other regions. And what we've seen from the data in China is that in the region where they've set up a lot of their hydroelectric plants, they've had a huge reduction in rainfall. And what that's meant is that they're now producing less electricity. So you might be thinking, well, that doesn't really matter because they can just build some more hydro plants. But as we've talked about, one of the issues when you're planning infrastructure is that when you set up a huge electric dam, you want to make sure that all of that electricity is used. So you then encourage industry to move to that area so that they can benefit firstly from cheap electricity and secondly renewable form of electricity. So you can then call all of your products green products. And that's exactly what's been happening with aluminium for China over the last few years. They're wanting to increase the amount of green aluminium that they're producing by utilizing that electricity that's coming from the hydro plants. But the problem is that when you have a drop in the water levels, you can't produce as much electricity. And when you've got an industry that is electricity hungry, that needs a huge amount on a regular basis, basically constant huge amounts of electricity, if you have a fall in your production, then you can't feed that plant, and therefore that plant is at risk of lying redundant. And that's what's happening in China right now. So that's obviously really bad news for those companies that have moved to that region. But it's also bad news for the Chinese economy because these companies are huge. So they're generating lots of aluminium, which is then being used by all of the other businesses in China. So it's a raw material that's really important. So there's a knock-on implication there in terms of, firstly, the amount of supply, and then secondly, the price. Because if there's a global reduction in the amount of aluminium kicking around, then that's going to force prices up. Simple economics tells us that. So that's bad news for China because they've got companies that are struggling to get their raw materials, so their profits will fall and therefore GDP will go down in China. But this is also bad news for the global economy because China is the world's biggest producer of aluminium. We saw that around 2/3 of all the aluminium is coming out of China at the moment. So if their producers are having problems, that means that it will affect the global supply. It will affect global prices, push them up. So that's going to increase the raw material costs for lots and lots of different industries because aluminium is used in tons of different applications. So that's pushing prices up as a result of the fact that there is less rainfall in China right now. So once again here, what I'm trying to do is join up the dots that tell you why extreme weather conditions in places that you've never heard of can have an impact on your daily life. Because the lack of rainfall in China can mean that the aluminium producers aren't getting enough electricity, therefore they can't produce enough aluminium, therefore the price of aluminium goes up, that increases the price of lots of other things and therefore pushes up inflation all across the world. So the overall summary of today's video is that the extreme weather that we're seeing currently all across the world is having a really negative impact on certain renewable energy forms such as hydro. I haven't touched on solar or wind today, but obviously extreme weather will also impact on both of those. When you have a reduction in the amount of electricity being produced from these renewable sources, it doesn't just impact on the local environment. It can have a global impact if those companies are global players, but also from an environmental point of view, if there is uncertainty with regards to renewable energy, then countries will move back to using coal, and that's obviously bad news in terms of CO2 emissions and global warming. And so the cycle continues turning, and this can become a vicious cycle. If a lot more coal is used over the next 10 to 20 years, that will increase the CO2, it'll increase global warming and makes things like hydroelectric even less attractive. So hopefully you've enjoyed today's video, you found it useful, informative and thought-provoking. If you've liked what I've said, then please give me a thumbs up. Thank you for watching this video all the way through to the end, and here's something to put a smile on your face.